official bilingualism in Canada, which is to say the equal legal status given to French and English. So when a politician does something controversial, that generally means one of two things. Either he did something that offended a large group of ordinary people, or he did something that offended a very small group of very powerful people. In Canada, there is no group smaller and more powerful than the Canadians who speak French. And last week, Ontario's Premier Doug Ford offended them by making two very controversial decisions. One, he halted the planned construction of a French language university in downtown Toronto.
A French university in Toronto. These people must be higher than me. Toronto. Less than 1% of the population speaks French. All the people who go to the university are gonna come from somewhere else. There's like no space in downtown Toronto for a university? What, you think this is gonna inspire kids growing up in the GTA to learn French? There are already 4 universities in Toronto. And they all like uber compete for new grads every year. If they wanted to put up a new French university in Ontario that would actually work, they could have done it somewhere in Eastern Ontario. Like maybe put a university in Cornwall. Oh, smack dab Toronto. They want to stick a French university. You could spend that money to further develop Laurentian's French university programs. L'Université Hearst, money to the already overpopulated garbage heap that Toronto is.
Let us take a step back and look at some numbers. I think that when you talk about French and English in Canada, a lot of the hard numbers tend to get lost in the conversation. In fact, I would say that when you talk about French and English in Canada, you're very explicitly not supposed to talk about numbers, because the numbers really conflict with, like, the mythology. So according to the most recent Canadian census, 17.9% of Canadians claim to be fluent in both French and English. 68.3% of Canadians only know English, while 11.9% of Canadians only know French. But in some ways, these national numbers can be somewhat deceptive because French-speaking Canadians are not sprinkled evenly across the country. In the province of Quebec, 50% of all residents claim to only be able to speak French, while 44.5% of Quebecers claim to be able to speak French and English. We crunch some of the other numbers, we see that 57.7% of all bilingual Canadians are in fact Quebecers.
Considering adequately in the administration of the Act the fact that French is rather difficult to learn in most English-speaking parts of the country.
And this is basically where we are in Canada today. Overall, 43% of all bureaucratic jobs in the Canadian federal government now require the employee to be bilingual. And remember, only 18% of Canadians are bilingual. This is mostly Quebec migrants and their offspring who have moved to other Canadian provinces over the years. It also includes children of certain upper middle class English Canadian families who have had access to the sort of resources to get their children a high quality French education at a young age. But if you do not come from a situation where French is an active part of the culture of your day-to-day life, it is unlikely that you will become fluent in French. This becomes...
I think the biggest problem with French in Canada is primarily how it's taught outside of Quebec and outside of the eastern provinces.
Very clear when we look at the rates of French fluency in provinces other than Quebec. The French-English bilingualism rate is 11.6%. In my province of British Columbia, the rate is 6.8%, and in Alberta, the rate is 6.6%.
And the lack of integration of French into everyday life, it starts with the education system. As a kid growing up in Ontario, I had this French teacher who would come into the classroom for about half an hour to 45 minutes a day and kind of just teach us really basic words.
These numbers are like way out of whack with the reality in the rest of Canada, which really goes a way of showing to the degree that Quebec is this very distinctive place that is very far removed from the Canadian norm.
He would continuously go over how to count in French, how to say the date in French, very basic weather descriptions. Cat, dog, apple. Later years, you got more like a solid hour to an hour and a half a day of French, and a lot of it was devoted to memorizing verbs and conjugating verbs and memorizing how to conjugate various tenses. It was very much about rote memory and rewriting out all the tenses of all sorts of different verbs over and over and over again. We would go home do all of our other work in English and talk with our friends in English, and French would never really come up again except for that one chunk in the day. So I can maybe figure out everyday basic items in French, get my way through the news and weather forecasts. I could count to 100. Could maybe order a meal at a restaurant. Yeah, that was a big one in French class, was being able to order a meal at a restaurant. I would never be able to handle a back and forth conversation with someone. You know, once you hit high school, it just all goes away. Or maybe you're lucky enough to have taken French in grade 9 and maybe grade 10, but for most kids, it just goes away after high school. A lot of this was maybe if you were going to go visit Quebec and play tourist for a couple of days, but it's not really useful for doing business with other people.
In fact, what's already happening is that you're going to have this very big, diverse country in which power is concentrated in the hands of a smaller and smaller linguistic elite with higher and higher barriers to entry. Unless the French Canadians really start breeding up a storm, they are just going to continue to be a smaller and smaller minority. Of Quebec, which was settled by the French and is the only part of Canada where French is the language of day-to-day life. There is only a small minority of Canadians who claim to be fluent in French and English. It's usually estimated at around 17% of the population, and these are disproportionately people who live in and around Quebec. However, because Canada is officially a bilingual country, it is considered important for all of the people in the top government jobs, which includes politicians and bureaucrats and judges and so forth, to be fluent in both French and English. This has the effect of concentrating a great deal of political power into a very small segment of the population, particularly bilingual Quebecers. There is a lot of denial and snobbery about this basic reality of Canada, however. A lot of bilinguals, particularly Quebec bilinguals, tend to minimize how difficult it is to learn a second language that you don't have any need for in your day-to-day life.
Most French taught outside of Quebec, and most French that gets taught as a core subject in schools is Parisian Metropolitan French, not Quebecese.
And let's be clear, the vast majority of Canadians do not have a need for French in their day-to-day life. And maybe it is a little bit arrogant, but the mathematical reality is that when you have a continent that looks like this, and the goal is effective communication, it makes much more sense for this part to learn English than this part to learn French.
Our pronunciation sucks. Our accent sucks. If we go to Quebec and try to speak French to somebody, or try to communicate with French with somebody over the phone, they just immediately default to English.
Essayer de discréditer la légitimité d'une nation, affirmer sa culture, sa langue et son histoire dans son propre pays en se basant purement sur une perspective mathématique, en soi c'est complètement stupide, mais de rajouter les États-Unis dans l'équation comme si ça devrait avoir un quelconque rapport avec la réalité culturelle canadienne, c'est purement absurde.
And it's like, why did you make me try? Why did you make me learn so much French and make me hurt myself so goddamn much if you're just going to default to English anyway and talk to me as if I'm a 4-year-old while you're doing it?
English Canadians, after all, who are being forced to learn an unnecessary and unneeded foreign language by their government in order to gain access to the halls of power, or be excluded if they cannot. So anyway, last year, in fact, almost exactly 1 year ago today, there was this big mass shooting at a Quebec mosque. A white guy opened fire during prayers and killed 6 Muslim men. Now, this was obviously a monstrous tragedy and not the kind of thing that people expect to happen in Canada, except that it does happen in Canada a fair bit, but mostly in Quebec. Home to a precious set of peculiarities that help make Canada the marvelous place it is. Privately, English Canadians are far less defensive. They grumble about Quebec's dark history of anti-Semitism, religious bigotry, and pro-fascist sentiment, facts which are rarely included in the otherwise self-flagellating official narratives of
Most people outside of Quebec just kind of ignore Quebec and leave it alone, and a lot of times they treat it like another country. Insularity within Quebec compared to the rest of Canada.
Canadian history. They complain about the exaggerated deference the province gets from Ottawa as a distinct society and nation within a nation, and its various French supremacist language and assimilation laws, which they blame for creating a place that's inhospitable, arrogant, and yes, noticeably more racist than the Canadian norm. And
only serves to create a further divide between English Canada and French Canada. Quebec kind of also reinforces this of laughing at us when we try to speak French, like this guy right here.
De toute façon, voyant le français de beaucoup de députés fédérales, vous avez encore bien du chemin à faire avant de pouvoir vous plaindre d'apprendre le français.
Et de l'importance de faire passer des entrevues face à face et ceux qui veulent venir vivre ici.
L'islam radical est une menace au Canada aujourd'hui. Et je voudrais l'immigration des régions pro-islam radical.
Issues such as post-secondary education, childcare, and, ironically enough, gun control, progressive Canadians laud its social democratic policies as moral exemplars, and the province has played an outsized role in pushing Canadian politics to the left.
Quebecers are considered to be more conservative and kind of more religious than the rest of Canada. But it's weird because at the same time, Quebec has really good healthcare and really good childcare and really good education. These are liberal-minded ideas, right? Not really. You see, the thing is also that Quebec has a slightly higher birth rate than the rest of Canada. Better healthcare, education, and free childcare, free daycare for families, especially if they are French-speaking native Quebec families, to encourage women to have more kids and keep the Quebecese French language and French culture going on and on.
Yes, they obviously speak French very badly because French is not a language with any relevance or presence in their day-to-day lives.